Alright, so let's talk about how the United States used trade policies and the Monroe Doctrine and other events like the War of 1812 to do its very best to get its big boy world power pants on in the early 19th century. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so in 1809, James Madison became president, and a chief goal of his was to strengthen the United States in the eyes of the world as a respectable world power. I mean, yes, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally established the independence of the United States, but great European powers didn't take the new nation as seriously as the Americans took themselves. It was kind of like when you were a kid and you dressed up as a superhero and you felt real awesome and you were sure that your mom would respect your obvious crime-fighting abilities. But then she looked at you and said, "Oh, you're so cute, but go finish folding my laundry." And that's kind of how the great European powers saw the United States. Case in point, after the Revolutionary War, Britain kept occupying forces in their western forts, and the Spanish sold weapons to American Indians and encouraged them to attack American migrants heading west. Clearly, there was a lack of respect for the new nation in a baggy superhero costume. But not to worry, the US attempted to enact several policies during this period to claim its spot on the stage of world powers. Oh, and by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all my videos, then check that link in the description. Okay, so the first way the US tried to claim its spot on the world stage was by promoting foreign trade. Now, recall from a previous video that one way European powers did not take the United States seriously was to ignore the position of US neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars. For example, British ships continued to impress or forcibly conscript American sailors, and the French seized American merchant ships as if they were enemies in the war. So to combat this, Thomas Jefferson led Congress to pass the Embargo Act, which cut off all US trade with foreign powers in hopes of forcing them to accept US neutrality. And to put it mildly, this law did not have the intended effect. Mainly the result of the Embargo Act was that the people in the US suffered economically on account of the sharp decline of international trade. Okay, so that didn't work, but just before James Madison took office, Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act in 1809, which replaced the Embargo Act. And basically, instead of cutting off all foreign trade, the Non-Intercourse Act cut off trade with Great Britain and France only. And opening the international economy helped somewhat, but it didn't have any dramatic effects and is generally considered a failure to address the nation's economic woes. And by my count, that's strike two on making European powers take us seriously, so what else we got? Well, a year later in 1810, Congress passed Macon's Bill No. 2 in order to stimulate the economy. And look, I'm not saying that I could do any better, but in hindsight, this was a pretty moronic piece of legislation, and I'm about to tell you why. First, the bill temporarily opened U.S. trade to Britain and France on the condition that their exported goods arrived to the U.S. on American ships. Second, the bill introduced a kind of international blackmail. Like, remember that the whole problem was that neither Britain nor France were respecting U.S. neutrality. So the bill said that if either country respected U.S. neutrality, then the U.S. would embargo the other country. In other words, if France agreed to respect U.S. neutrality and stop seizing ships and cargo, then the U.S. would close off trade with Great Britain, or vice versa. So while the goal of this legislation was to increase the stature of the United States in the eyes of European powers, it actually did the opposite. Like, the leader of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, heard this and was like, "It's like they're begging me to take advantage of that." And that's exactly what he did. He sent a letter to Madison agreeing to respect U.S. neutrality, and so the U.S. cut off trade with Great Britain, which hurt them economically while they were trying to wage war against France. And to be clear, Madison was pretty suspicious of Napoleon's motives, but in the end, he really didn't have a choice. So not only did that move increase tensions between Great Britain and the U.S., but Napoleon used the U.S. for his own gain since he never intended to honor American neutrality in the first place. And in the end, this series of laws only proved that when it came to global affairs, the U.S. was in fact not a big boy, but very much a small boy. Okay, so maybe the U.S. can gain some respect on the world stage by claiming territory here in North America, so let's see how that goes. And just to be clear, a big part of this desire to expand was the U.S. desire to bring the Indian policy under federal control and therefore open American Indian lands to U.S. expansion. Now, after U.S. troops defeated an American Indian alliance at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, American Indians in the Ohio River Valley created a new alliance to resist American migration into their lands. And the alliance was led by a Shawnee prophet named Tenskwatawa and his warrior brother Tecumseh. They instructed their followers to give up all aspects of white culture and fight to establish their right to remain in their ancestral land. And if they did so, the Great Spirit would protect them and facilitate their success. And if your little neurons are twitching right now because that sounds a lot like the Pueblo Revolt from Unit 1, then give your brain a high five. Anyways, the movement gathered more followers. They established their base in modern-day Indiana, a settlement known as Prophet Town, situated along the Tippecanoe River in 1808. And then later, the territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, met with several tribal leaders, got them drunk, and persuaded them to sell the U.S. millions of acres for a fraction of its worth. Now, that sounds like a dirty move. Well, then Tecumseh would agree with you. When he heard about about it, Tecumseh was enraged not only because of the trickery, but because American Indians did not believe that land could be bought and sold like a commodity since it belonged to all of them communally. Therefore, Tecumseh intensified his efforts to recruit other American Indian groups to their resistance movement. And while he was away in the South recruiting more people to his movement, Harrison apparently thought it was time for yet another dirty move. He sent troops to attack Prophet Town, and with their main warrior gone, the U.S. secured an easy victory. And so in the aftermath, Tecumseh and many of his followers retreated to Canada, where they allied with the British and would eventually fight against the Americans in the War of 1812. Now, there were certainly more territorial gains during this period, but I'll tell you about them in a moment. But for now, we need to focus on how the U.S. actually did gain some respect on the world stage, and that happened as the result of the War of 1812, which was followed up by the Monroe Doctrine, so let's talk about each. Now, the War of 1812 was another conflict between the United States and Great Britain, and some historians even call it a second War of Independence. So remember that animosity between the U.S. and Great Britain had been growing ever since the ink was dry on the dang Treaty of Paris. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, Great Britain refused to evacuate troops from its western forts in what was now U.S. territory. And more than that, the British continued to sell arms to American Indian groups to help them resist American westward expansion. And don't forget about the increasing tension on account of Macon's Bill No. 2 that France used to punish Great Britain economically. But the last straw for the U.S. was the continued British practice of impressment. Basically, in order to keep up with the demand for sailors on their Navy ships, whenever Great Britain seized an American merchant ship, they forced the Americans on board to serve in the Royal Navy. So not only was this an egregious violation of U.S. neutrality regarding the Napoleonic Wars, it was a national insult to Americans who had fought to be free of British rule. So it was about that time that a debate rose among American leaders about the prospect of declaring war on Great Britain. Now, supporters of the war, known as war hawks, argued that Great Britain would be too distracted by their conflict with France to pose much of a threat. And if the U.S. won, that would end Britain's threats to U.S. neutrality, while bonus also proving the U.S. to be a major player on the world stage. But on the other side of the debate were mostly industrial New England Federalists who wanted a renewal of trade with Great Britain, which would improve their own economic lot drastically. And therefore, they staunchly opposed the war. Now, in the end, despite massive military disadvantages, the U.S. declared war on Great Britain. It lasted a little more than 2 years, and ultimately it ended in something of a stalemate. The Americans had some success in driving the British back into Canada, but for the most part, the war was a toss-up. But by 1814, Great Britain could no longer justify the cost of the war, and the two nations signed the Treaty of Ghent, in which both sides agreed to give up the lands taken in the war and revert back to the territorial arrangement present in 1812. So to be clear, the war did not result in any territorial gains for the United States, but its main effect was to boost the standing of the U.S. in the eyes of the world. Like, this was now the second time the young United States had defeated Great Britain, the world's foremost superpower. I mean, to be fair, to say they defeated Britain is a stretch because it was more like they just didn't lose, but, you know, we'll take it. And so with a new set of global power pants, the U.S. took it one step further a few years later by issuing the Monroe Doctrine. Now, for context, James Monroe was elected in 1816, and under his leadership, the U.S. gained metric buttloads of new territory. For example, Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, negotiated treaties that established the U.S.-Canada border at the 49th parallel and agreed to joint U.S.-British occupation of the Oregon Territory. Then, in 1819, Adams negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty, in which Spain agreed to cede Florida to the United States. And at the very same time, several Latin American countries were revolting and throwing off their European imperial overlords. And so that, combined with Monroe's success in shoring up the growing U.S. territory at the expense of European powers, provided the opportunity to announce the Monroe Doctrine. It basically announced to the world that the Western Hemisphere was a U.S. sphere of influence and that any further European colonization or intrusion was unwelcome and would be resisted. On the flip side, the U.S. promised not to meddle in European affairs. Regardless, it was kind of like America lifted its leg and urinated all over the Western Hemisphere, much like a dog might pee on a mailbox in order to claim it. Whoa, put that leg down, son. As you can smell, this here hemisphere belongs to the United States. And for better or worse, these developments ultimately led the United States to take a more significant place of power on the world stage. Okay, you can click here to watch my other Unit 4 videos, or you can click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you cram all the contents of this course firmly into your brain fold. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.